Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you guys with the most up-to-date political, economic and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Okay, happy Monday everybody. Another week, another new series of more bearish forecasts from international bodies and economists on the Chinese economy. This is a trend which we have been seeing since at least the end of Q1 this year, with an ongoing housing crisis, zero COVID, and to less consequence, drought in the southwest of the country. We should expect to see more slowdown in at least the next few months, if not longer. According to Bloomberg's latest quarterly survey of economists, China's economy is now projected to grow just 3.5% this year, down from a previous forecast of 3.9%. This mainstream view is more in line with what Nomura analysts projected last week. Quote, "The downgrade suggests economists aren't convinced Beijing's recent stimulus measures, which more recently include 1 trillion yuan in funds largely for infrastructure projects and central bank rate cuts, can help counter the slowdown." End quote. One of the economists surveyed, Raymond Young, chief economist for ANZ Bank Greater China, expressed that beyond the current challenges, the economy's underlying risks, such as demographics, will keep growth under 5% over the next few years, expressing, quote, "Potential growth will continue to slow given the lack of productivity improvement. We pencil in GDP growth of 4.2% in 2023 and 4% in 2024. End quote. This is quite a statement considering that Beijing has set growth for 5.5% this year, that is, as a target. While 4% does sound high, especially for those of us from developed economies, for an economy with low per capita income and activity like the People's Republic of China, this 4% represents a painful slowdown. This also assumes that Beijing will successfully manage the housing crisis, a question of which the jury is still very much out on. Meanwhile, analysts warn that with likely US Federal Reserve rate hikes coming down the road, the People's Bank of China, China's central bank, will have less room to lower its own interest rates. Economists expect US interest rates to rise to 3.5% or a little higher. China's benchmark rate is currently sitting at 3.65%. Quote, "This is bad news for China because it narrows the room for cuts even further at a time when China's economy needs it the most. The central bank, however, will need to tighten capital controls on outflows even further." End quote. Zhang Zhiwei, chief economist at Pinpoint Asset Management, warns that China-based capital will be tempted to seek higher returns in the United States if rates there increase. And, quote, "Capital outflows will likely pick up in the second half of this year." End quote. Others argue, however, that risks of capital outflow are manageable as China has a comparatively closed capital account, and that frankly, outside of hits to exports from reduced global demand, China's economic issues are primarily internal. The waves caused by US interest hikes thus will crash harder on Japanese and European shores. And speaking of the Europeans, in a sign of increased European concern towards Chinese ambitions in the Pacific region, major NATO members, France and Germany, have sent military deployments to the Indo-Pacific to take part in multinational exercises in Australia, joining Singapore, South Korea, Japan and others. France sent planes to New Caledonia, its overseas territory, with a technical stopover in India. The German Air Force has sent 13 military aircraft to the region for the first time ever, with the Air Force's Chief of Staff expressing that the Central European power wanted to show that it can be in the Pacific, quote, "within a day," end quote. The German deployment is notable as, in contrast to France, the European industrial powerhouse doesn't possess territories in the Pacific, and unlike its Anglo-Franco peers, has engaged in very few military actions since the end of World War II. We have been following a reinvigorated NATO since the Russian invasion of Ukraine earlier this year, though the lion's share of the sharpened focus has been on the Russian East. We've also seen this year a NATO more willing to think about China. We remember that China was mentioned for the first time in a mission statement this year, being designated as a, quote, systemic challenge, end quote. Despite this, however, the nations, especially Germany, sell a lot to the Chinese market, and as such are describing the military deployment as necessary for regional stability, while not referring to China by name. Quote, French officials frequently insist that our Indo-Pacific strategy is not directed against China and differs from approaches that prioritize military confrontation alone. We have sovereignty issues in the region and must protect our 7 territories in the Indo-Pacific and the more than 1.5 million French people who live there. End quote. Hey guys, if you enjoyed today's episode of China Update, don't forget to hit the like button. And as always, anyone who wants to go the extra mile and help me keep China Update sustainable, continue to produce these episodes for free every day for you guys, Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below. This is one of the best ways to support the channel. As always, thank you so much everybody for the ongoing support. The popular newsletter Discourse Power published a great piece last week on a recent seminar in Shanghai, which invited leading academic and political voices in China to discuss ideas surrounding creating a new world order, national security, and geopolitics. This seminar gives us an excellent look at how these themes and ideas are being discussed in elite circles in the People's Republic of China. Now, some of these quotes are quite long, but I think they're very important for us to examine. Here are a few excerpts. Quote, There are 2 major gaps in contemporary China's renewed relationship with the outside world, which pose a significant strategic challenge for China at the moment. The first is the great divide separating how Chinese people see themselves and how Western society sees China. There's a significant gap between how we see ourselves and how the rest of the international community sees us. Another major difference is in the way we see the world and how people in other nations see it. China's perspectives, narratives, and discourses differ from the rest of the world in terms of understanding even basic ideas and concepts. This can be anything from the great changes unseen in a century, globalization, and global governance, to rules, democracy, and human rights. The Chinese worldview in the new era exhibits a number of new characteristics and approaches. The new features of China's worldview include 3 main aspects. 1. It is more open and inclusive and places its overall global outlook higher on the agenda. China has put forward inclusive concepts that embrace the interests of all under heaven. 2. It exudes more self-confidence and calm. China can now face the world squarely. It is more self-confident and proactive, with a more rational and mature worldview. And 3. It prioritizes fairness and justice while promoting global governance. End quote. Now, whether we agree or not with these characterizations, what is most important here for our purposes is that we understand how these ideas are being articulated among elites in Beijing and Shanghai and disseminated to the general population. Now, for the next speaker, who called on China to build a new world order and described how China should, quote, respond, end quote, to the US and the West. Quote, China's international strategy should first maintain the UN's central role in the international system, then establish new international political, economic, and security mechanisms, and finally reform the international system. What the US is now attempting is to devolve the system back to the old US-led, Western-centric system. China, on the other hand, wishes to see the international system evolve towards fairness and justice. We shall work to better reflect the interests and aspirations of developing and emerging economies. The existing international mechanisms and systems primarily reflect the interests of the US and the West. We must increase the number of platforms through which China can play a constructive role in international affairs. The opportunities for us to play a role are dwindling in light of US strategic competition with China, which is really just strategic containment and suppression. End quote. And for the last speaker, who isn't an academic but rather a political actor, quote, the US-led group of countries sees Russia as a current security threat and China as a longer-term systemic threat. They are strategically constructing a China threat theory, i.e. the strategic demonization of China. This is reflected not only in the media hype and anti-China rhetoric of some politicians, but also in the introduction of anti-China perceptions into the social sphere and the daily lives of their people." End quote. China opposes the ideologization of international relations, but the US-led group's values-based democracy is a systemic and ideologically driven hegemony that must be confronted head-on. I believe we should concentrate our efforts on the 4 dimensions of actions listed below." End quote. He then lists the 4 points, and these 4 points give us an idea of what to anticipate from Chinese diplomats and state media strategy in the coming years. Now quoting him again. "First, to begin, we must base our actions on Xi Jinping thought and diplomacy. Second, it is critical to reduce our external communication deficit. Third, the effectiveness of action is dependent on the interaction of internal and external communications. China's external communication methodology continues to lack a systemic and consistent supply of discourse. We must also vigorously improve our international discourse capacity, particularly by developing new concepts and categories that can be understood and accepted by the international community. To do so, we must be familiar with the target country's national characteristics, linguistic diversity, and discourse environment. Fourth, the supply-side quality of our actions is dependent on the collaboration of participants from various fields and levels. International communication necessitates collaboration among government, academia, and media, and the general public." End quote. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching. I'll see you tomorrow.